Chicago at night was a restless symphony of lights, traffic, and neon glow. On the 40th floor of a glass tower overlooking the city, the penthouse door opened without warning. Alexander Reed, billionaire investor, cold strategist, a man used to controlling every variable in his empire, had returned earlier than anyone expected. Not even his wife Claudia knew he would be back tonight. He tossed his rain-damp coat across the arm of a chair and loosened his tie. What he wanted was simple: a stiff drink, 5 minutes of silence. Maybe the comfort of forgetting the endless contracts waiting on his desk. But the moment he stepped further inside, silence betrayed him. It wasn't silence at all. Somewhere deeper in the apartment, a sound broke the stillness. At first, Alexander thought it was the dishwasher humming. Then he realized no. It was softer, fractured human. Sobbing, the sound pulled him toward the kitchen like an invisible thread. He moved quickly, unease gnawing at his chest, and when he reached the doorway, the world seemed to tilt. Maya Lopez, his young live-in maid, was on the floor. Her dark uniform was ripped, streaked in crimson. Blood stained the marble tiles, smeared across the cabinet doors, dripping from her trembling hand as she clutched a dish towel to her side. For a split second, Alexander froze. This wasn't the picture of quiet domestic service he'd known for years. This was chaos, raw and brutal. Maya, his voice cracked as he rushed to her side. She looked up at him, eyes wide, glassy with terror, as if she were the intruder in his home and not the other way around. "Please, don't." The words faltered into a cough that shook her entire body. Alexander slid to his knees, reaching out his hands, hovering before he dared touch her. Her skin was ice cold. This was no kitchen accident, no careless cut from a knife. The gash at her side was deep, purposeful. Someone had meant for this to happen. "You're going to the hospital. Right now." He was already pulling out his phone with one hand while steadying her with the other. As he lifted her into his arms, something else caught his eye. A faint shadow just beneath her hairline, a bruise yellowing at the edges, old but unmistakable. Rage, hot and immediate, flickered in his chest. This wasn't the first time. The elevator ride blurred. By the time he laid her carefully into the passenger seat of his black sedan, Alexander's jaw was locked and his mind a storm of questions. Maya whimpered with every bump in the road, her head leaning against the glass as though she had no strength left to hold it up. He pressed harder on the accelerator. The city outside glittered oblivious, but inside the car the air was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the fragile sound of her shallow breaths. Red lights, horns, sirens in the distance. Alexander ignored them all, racing through the streets like a man possessed. In his head the same question thundered again and again. Who did this to her? He had hired Maya 3 years ago. Quiet, respectful, almost invisible in her routines. She had never asked for anything, never complained, never even raised her voice. And yet now she sat broken beside him, soaked in blood, too afraid to speak. Something was wrong in his house. Something had been wrong for a long time. He just hadn't seen it, or maybe he hadn't wanted to. Tonight, he thought grimly, everything changes. The emergency room doors slid open on a rush of white light and disinfectant. Alexander carried Maya past the admitting desk. Before anyone could stop him, his shirt cuff smeared red where her hand had been. A nurse intercepted with a gurney, quick questions, firing like a metronome. Name-age allergies. When did the bleeding start? Alexander answered what he could, while Maya's voice thinned to a whisper that dissolved into air. Within moments, she vanished behind a curtain swallowed by hands in blue gloves and the slow beeping of machines. He stood there with her blood drying on his skin and the noise of the hospital swelling around him. His body wanted to pace. His mind wanted to bargain. His instincts wanted to punish. He did none of those things. He stood very still, the way a man stands when he suddenly understands there are parts of his life he hasn't been looking at closely enough. A doctor in scrubs approached with a composure Alexander recognized from boardrooms, the kind that only looks like calm because panic is too expensive. "The laceration is deep," the man said. "Not an accident. We're controlling the bleeding. She'll need fluid scans, a surgical consult." He paused, studied Alexander a beat longer. "There are older contusions, too. Different stages of healing. You should be aware." Alexander nodded once. He didn't trust his voice. The doctor left and the curtain closed again, and Alexander took a seat where he could watch it, as if his gaze alone could keep it from moving. He texted his driver to take the night off. He silenced his phone. He didn't call Claudia. It wasn't that he forgot. It was that some decisions feel like stepping into a cold lake. If you hesitate, you'll never go under. He wasn't ready to hear her voice suspended between concern and performance, the way it could be when an audience might be listening. Sometime after midnight, footsteps that sounded like a verdict came down the hallway. They were familiar too, sharp-measured, expensive. Claudia swept into view in a white cashmere coat and heels that made the floor answer her. She wore her hair pinned up and her face arranged into the expression of a woman both worried and above the worry. "You texted me, only hospital come. What happened?" Her tone was soft enough to be overheard. "She's in surgery. There's a deep cut. The doctor said it wasn't an accident." "And older injuries?" Alexander's voice was flat. Claudia's eyes widened, the way cameras like. "That's terrible. She's so delicate. Always dropping things. Always bumping into..." "Clumsy doesn't give you a bruise with the edges turning yellow." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He watched the tiny pause that followed the fractional delay where the brain rewrites its line. "Well," she said, squeezing his forearm with careful sympathy, "let's not jump to conclusions. People fall. People cut themselves. Kitchens there are knives. You know how it is." A nurse stepped through the curtain to say they'd stabilized the bleeding and were moving Maya to observation. Alexander thanked her and stood. "I'll be here when she wakes up," he said. Claudia's hand slid from his arm. "Of course. We'll do whatever needs to be done." Her smile stayed on. Her eyes did not. When Maya opened her eyes, hours later, the room had softened into gray dawn. Alexander was a silhouette in the chair by the window, tie-loosened jacket folded neatly over the back. He rose when he saw her looking, and crossed the space between them with the care of a man approaching the edge of a cliff he cannot see the bottom of. "You're safe," he said. "You're at Mercy General. The bleeding's under control. You're going to be okay." She blinked, slow disbelieving. Her lips parted as if to answer, then closed again. The movement pulled at the bandage under the blanket, and she winced. She turned her face toward the window, toward the thin strip of morning, and swallowed words that seemed to hurt on the way down. Alexander waited. Silence can be a kindness when urgency would only break what's already fragile. He poured water, lifted the cup toward her. She took it with both hands. Still the cup trembled. He wanted to ask who. He wanted to ask how long. He wanted to say he was sorry. He said none of those things. Instead, "Do you want me to call anyone?" "Family." She gave the smallest shake of her head. "There's no one." Claudia arrived with lilies and a voice dipped in honey. She kissed the air by Maya's cheek and told her how very sorry she was. How very shocking this must be. How they would find whoever did this. How she'd already told the staff to double-check the knives, the cleaners, the contractors. You just never know with strangers these days. Alexander excused himself to find coffee. He knew he didn't know how he knew, but he did that leaving the room was a mistake that made a different kind of sense. When he returned, Claudia's smile was theater bright, and Maya's hands were knitted in the blanket so tightly her knuckles were white. She wouldn't meet his eyes. He felt something in him harden into a point. He hired a private nurse and moved Maya to a quiet room on an upper floor with a view that made the city look like a promise. He signed the forms to cover every bill. He instructed security at the hospital that no one visited without his approval. The nurse took to him with the gentle professionalism people reserve for grievers. He accepted the tenderness for what it was, an admission that this was a kind of grief. At home, he showered the hospital from his skin and went to his study. He opened a panel of wood at the back of a shelf to reveal the security brain wires, redundant backups, an index of all the quiet eyes embedded in his home. He had installed the system after a break-in on the 26th floor of a neighboring building. It had felt prudent then, distant insurance, something you do for the sake of paper and premiums. He had never watched his own life back like this. He queued up the kitchen, the hallway, the living room where Maya sometimes dusted the piano he never played. He scrubbed backwards through weeks, like flipping through a stranger's photo album too quickly to be polite. The apartment unfolded at high-speed cleaners with carts, a florist arranging orchids, a caterer's assistant sneaking an extra chocolate. And then he saw what he was looking for without knowing he had been looking for it. Claudia entered the kitchen on a Tuesday morning, still in her silk robe. She lifted a plate Maya had just set down, frowned as if the food were an insult, and let it slide from her hand to the floor. Maya flinched. Claudia didn't. She said something the camera couldn't hear and pressed Maya back with 2 fingers, and then her palm not hard enough to leave a mark you could photograph, hard enough to leave the kind that changes how a person walks through a room. The breath left Alexander's lungs in a way that made him aware of their edges. He fast-forwarded to Wednesday. Claudia again, a glass of juice flung into the sink, while Maya reached for a towel, the movement too quick, the shove too practiced. Thursday, Friday. Variations on a theme control expressed in Engel's contempt, hidden in the choreography of a home. He found the night before the blood. The kitchen was otherwise empty of anyone but them. Claudia sliced fruit at the island blade flashing. Maya stood with a trash bag open, waiting for Claudia to drop ends and peels. Claudia turned, said something, and stepped close enough that the camera angle caught their shoulders and hands, but not their faces. Alexander leaned toward the screen, like proximity alone could change the past. He saw the knife rest against fabric, a pause where meaning gathered, and then a flinch, a jerk, a stain blooming. Maya's hand flew to her side. Claudia's mouth moved in the shape of a sentence he could not hear. The rage that came then was cold and mathematical, the kind that can do damage without raising its voice. Alexander closed the laptop and sat in the quiet with his hands flat on the desk, as if to steady the table, as if the room had tilted. He called his head of security first, then his attorney, then a woman he trusted named Priya, who ran a non-profit that trained domestic workers on their rights and funded relocation for those in danger. He did not call Claudia. The next morning he returned to the hospital with a cup of tea sweetened because the nurse had said Maya took sugar. He told her he needed to show her something, and if she asked him to stop, he would stop. She nodded, small and scared. He held the tablet where she could see it. He watched the moment play across her face. The one where a person realizes that the thing that has been happening to them in the privacy of a room now exists outside of them, out where it can be shared and believed. Her shoulders shook once. She didn't cry. She reached for the blanket, grabbed the corner, and held on. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have known sooner." She stared at the screen a beat longer, and then at him. "Please don't let her hurt anyone else." He promised without flourish, "I won't." He arranged for Maya to be discharged to a hotel under a different name, with a nurse housed on the same floor. He assigned 2 guards to the hallway and put Priya's card with a cell number on the bedside table. "If you decide to press charges," he said, "we'll support you whatever you need. If you decide not to, we'll respect that and still keep you safe." Her eyes filled not with tears so much as with light returning slowly to a room after a storm has passed. Claudia's first call came mid-afternoon. "Where are you?" "Why aren't you home? We need to talk." It was followed by a text with a heart and then one without one. He responded to none of it. Instead, he sent out invitations to an intimate fundraiser at the Penthouse for the Reed Foundation's new educational initiative. He booked a string quartet. He called the caterer whose staff didn't gossip. He told security to double headcount and let no journalists in. On the night of the event, the apartment glowed with a warmth money can purchase, but not invent. People who wore their wealth lightly sipped wine and praised the view. Claudia was incandescent in green silk, her laughter brighter than the chandeliers. She placed a hand on Alexander's back, sometimes gentle reminders, to look pleased to be photographed, to send signals she understood better than anybody. He gave her thumbnails of smiles and watched the elevator. Maya stepped out in a navy dress that belonged to Priya's closet because Maya owned nothing that would have made sense here. The sling kept her arms still, but couldn't hide the steadiness with which she stood. Conversations dimmed as she walked in. Alexander crossed the room and asked quietly if she was ready. She nodded once. He tapped his glass, and the room obediently silenced. Claudia turned toward him with the expression she wore for donors. Alexander spoke to the room about education, about safety in homes, about the foundation's expanded work with domestic worker training. He said words that mattered and had nothing to do with money. Then he said this: "Sometimes change starts at home." The screen descended from its recess with a soft motor hum that made heads tip up. He pressed play. The footage did not require narration. It required only witnesses. The videos unspooled without commentary. A plate tipped on a Tuesday. A shoulder pressed on a Thursday. A blade like a thought, then an act. People watched differently depending on the kind of person they were. Some put a hand over their mouth. Some simply watched and believed because they had always believed such things could happen in a beautiful room with a view. Claudia's smile cracked across her face like something baked too fast. "This is absurd," she said too loudly. "It's out of context." "It's not this is manipulation," Alexander faced her. "The context is that you harmed a woman who works in our home. You did it over and over. You did it because you could. That ends tonight." No one moved. It's always surprising, Alexander thought, how quiet justice can be. In the moment it appears. Security stepped forward. Claudia's eyes darted and caught on faces that had nodded at her across tables, that had asked her where she'd bought her shoes, that had accepted her as a particular version of a wife. They blinked now and looked away. "You can't make a spectacle of me." She hissed, the silk of her voice torn. "Not here. Not in my home." Alexander's reply was soft. "This is our home. You made it dangerous. You don't live here anymore." She laughed, a strangled, disbelieving sound. "You think you can just..." "There's a separation agreement in your email. A car is waiting downstairs. Your things will be sent to the hotel of your choice by morning. The lawyers will handle the rest." He didn't say the other part out loud, that there was also a copy of the footage in the hands of his attorney, and another with Priya, that there was a complaint ready to be filed if Maya chose that path, that there was a restraining order prepared for a judge to sign at 9 a.m. He didn't need to. Claudia understood paperwork better than she understood love. Security escorted her from the room, not roughly, not kindly, just as if moving a dangerous object from a place it could do harm. The door clicked, and like the quartet found their instruments again out of reflex alone, and someone in the back of the room let out a breath that sounded like an apology. The party unspooled itself awkwardly after that, as gatherings do when the purpose they thought they had finds itself replaced by the one it needed. People came to Maya in twos and threes to say they were sorry, or they had seen, or they had not seen, and would pay closer attention now. Priya appeared and put a hand on Maya's uninjured shoulder, and the two women stood saying almost nothing for a long time. Alexander joined them and asked Maya if she wanted to stay or leave. She said she wanted to breathe air that didn't belong to this apartment. They rode the elevator down with the same quiet you hear after a storm has taken the last branch it planned to take. Outside, the city glittered the same as it had at the beginning of all this. It was one of the small cruelties of the world that it kept going. Alexander tucked Maya into the back seat of a car, and then, unthinking, took the front himself. They drove without talking until the lake came into view, black as a thought rimmed with lamps. He parked and the two of them got out and stood side by side looking at the water. The wind off it was cold enough to make a person feel clean. Finally, Maya said, "I kept waiting for someone to believe me. I didn't even say the words out loud, and still I kept waiting." "You shouldn't have had to say them," he answered. She nodded. "I don't know what happens next." "Whatever you choose," he said. The word sounded strange in his mouth. He recognized how rarely he offered it. Maya did press charges. It was her decision, and when she made it all the way. Claudia's attorney argued about context and angles, and how knives and kitchens and accidents make a complicated story. The prosecutor told the simpler one. The judge believed the simpler one. The order keeping Claudia away from Maya and the Reed residence was signed in a courtroom that smelled like wood and effort. Alexander stepped down from boards that had seemed essential the month before, and allocated those hours to the Foundation's new domestic workers' safety program. He learned what it meant to listen in rooms where previously he had only ever given instructions. He moved through his home differently, aware of the spaces where power sits without being asked to. Maya healed the way people do with setbacks and triumphs nobody sees. She learned the names of the nurses who had first held her life in their hands, and then she forgot them when she no longer needed to remember. She started taking a short walk each morning before breakfast, a practice she'd once given to other people by scrubbing floors before they woke up. She left the hotel for a sunny apartment with a plant she didn't know how to keep alive, and a chair by a window she did. Alexander asked her if she would consider coming back to work for him in a different capacity, salary, benefits, boundaries written down, and signed a job description with dignity built into its edges. She thanked him and said she wanted to try something else. He felt the sting and then the relief. Control had never been the point. Months later, they crossed paths at a fundraiser for the foundation, this time a public one, in a glass building that turned the setting sun into art. Maya wore a simple dress and a small necklace, and the air of a person who had survived something and built new rooms inside herself where fear used to live. He asked how she was. She said good. She asked how he was. He said learning. They both smiled like people who know that honest answers are sometimes as brief as they are true. If you are listening to this and your breath caught at the sound of someone crying in a room that should have been safe, you're not alone. If you heard Maya and recognized yourself or your neighbor or the woman you pass every morning, remember this belief is a kind of shelter we can build for one another. Ask a gentle question. Pay attention to the small changes in someone's voice. Keep a number in your phone you might never use until the day you do. If this story moved, you share it with someone who needs to be reminded that silence isn't the same as safety. Leave a comment with what you would have done in Alexander's place, or what you wish he had done sooner. And if you want more stories that hold both the dark and the light, with equal care, subscribe and stay with us. The next story might be the one you need when a door opens, and the room is not what you expected. Weeks turned into months, and the scandal that had once shaken Chicago's elite began to fade from headlines. Claudia Reed's name no longer commanded respect at charity luncheons. It drew whispers, raised eyebrows, and invitations that mysteriously never arrived. For Alexander, silence settled over the penthouse like a fragile truce. He worked, he read, he walked through rooms that suddenly seemed too wide, too polished, too empty. Yet every so often he caught himself pausing by the kitchen doorway, half expecting to hear Maya humming as she polished the counters. He never did. He told himself it was for the best. She deserved a new life free from these walls. Still, absence has its own voice, and sometimes it was louder than the noise of the city below. One rainy Thursday evening, the buzzer at his private elevator rang. He wasn't expecting anyone. When the doors opened, he found Priya standing there, raincoat dripping a folder tucked beneath her arm. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. In his study with the city glittering through the glass, Priya spread the papers across his desk. "Claudia is trying to launch a countersuit. Defamation. Claims the footage was doctored." Alexander's jaw tightened. The footage is real. She knows that. But she's betting on the noise, the spectacle. If she can make enough people doubt Priya's gaze was steady, Maya will be dragged back into it. Depositions. Cross-examinations. Do you understand what that could do to her recovery? The thought twisted in his chest. He had promised Maya safety, freedom. To see her once again pulled into Claudia's orbit felt like betrayal all over again. "What do? We fight," Priya said simply. But this time not just with lawyers. With allies. Maya needs more than your protection. She needs visibility. People who will believe her before she has to bleed for proof. The following weeks unfolded in a rhythm Alexander had never imagined for himself. Fundraisers not for skyscrapers or hedge funds, but for shelters. Meetings not with investors, but with advocates. He sat in rooms where his wealth meant less than his willingness to listen. Slowly, he understood that justice wasn't a one-night spectacle. It was daily, messy, often invisible work. Then one afternoon, as he was leaving a community center, he saw her. Maya was standing by the door, holding a small stack of pamphlets. Her arm was no longer in a sling. She wore jeans, a simple sweater, and a calmness that hadn't been there before. When she saw him, surprise flickered across her face, followed by something gentler. "You came," she said. "I promised," Alexander replied. They stood in silence for a moment, the city buzzing around them. Then Maya handed him a pamphlet. "Self-defense workshops. I help teach them now. It's different standing in front of a room and speaking, but it feels like taking something back. He looked at the pamphlet, then at her. You're stronger than anyone gave you credit for. Her smile was small but real. I had to be. As they spoke, a young woman approached Maya with a nervous question about the program. Maya turned instantly, patient, attentive, her presence steadying the girl. Alexander stepped back watching. She didn't need him anymore, not the way she once had. And maybe that was the truest measure of what they'd survived. That night, back in his penthouse, Alexander poured himself a drink he didn't finish. The city sprawled beyond the glass, endless and different. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a future where he wasn't simply the man who had once failed to notice the shadows in his own home. He could be more than that. Maya already was.